Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, welcome back to another episode of Pop Culture Junkies. Today we're going to do an episode of Know Your Lore, how Neil Gaiman made a Marvel comic just to finance his legal case against Todd McFarlane. Let's go. All right, so this is a bit of a long one, guys. I'm trying to keep it just to the facts that I have to keep it to, but there's a lot of history in this one. Hopefully, for those of you that enjoy Know Your Lore, you're really going to dig this one. This story really starts with Todd McFarlane, the Todd father, hero of all indie comic stories. Everyone thinks they can be the next Spawn with their indie comic. His name brings to mind Spider-Man covers and sticking it to the biggest publisher in the industry. Not all those rainbows from unicorn butts with Todd McFarlane. You can just ask Neil Gaiman. Neil wrote an entire Marvel Comics series, or so it's rumored, just to finance his legal war against Todd. So let's dive into the story, boys and girls. We're going to take a quick trip back in history for this story. It actually starts with Captain Marvel, not Carol Danvers, but the original Captain Marvel published by Fawcett Comics. He's now known as Shazam. This Captain Marvel debuts in 1940, 1 year after Superman, who's a huge hit, and every other comic company wants to cash in on this superhero craze. He essentially has Superman's power set, so guess what? DC, who was at the time known as National Comics, sues Fawcett, partially because Captain Marvel was outselling Superman at times, and because they really just cloned the character outside of freezing breath and heat vision. So DC claims copyright infringement. It takes 12 years of lawsuits to end this dispute. A judge finally agrees with DC. Fawcett's Captain Marvel stops being published in 1953. In an ironic twist, DC later buys the rights to Captain Marvel / Shazam, but can't use the name Captain Marvel anymore on the cover due to disputes with Marvel Comics. That's a story for another episode. In the UK, there was a publisher. They were named L. Miller & Son, and they had been reprinting Fawcett's Captain Marvel. So when the lawsuit ended, their cash cow was suddenly going to be gone. They had to find a new one. They took the Shazam framework and created a new hero, Marvel Man. Marvel Man was essentially the same powers. He said a magic word, became a superhero with super strength, super speed, and vulnerability, etc. He was science-based versus magic-based. His magic word was not Shazam. For those of you that don't know, Shazam is an acronym for a bunch of wizards and gods that give Captain Marvel his powers. Marvel Man said the word Komoda, which is atomic, spelled backward with a K. Other than that, they're essentially identically the same character. It's ironic because Fawcett's not around to sue them at the time to say hey, you just created our character, no one cares. And he's not called Superman. He's in the UK, so no one cares about him as far as DC's concerned, right? They can't do anything, and they're not doing anything about it. So Marvel Man, essentially Shazam, comes out. He's published in his own strips. He even had kid sidekicks like the Captain Marvel family. Marvel Man's printed in new strips up until 1962 when he goes out of print. Marvel Man's brought back in 1982 and Alan Moore picks up writing duties. It's a much darker, violent take on this kid superhero from the 40s. Pacific Comics in the US gains the rights to publish stories featuring Marvel Man. They eventually file for bankruptcy before they put out an issue. Eclipse Comics picks up the rights from there. In 1985, they begin to release the stories, but the character is now titled Miracle Man. They didn't want to deal with Marvel Comics in a lawsuit over the name, so they just renamed it and called him Miracle Man. And that's why he's called Miracle Man to this day, boys and girls. Alan Moore continued to pick up writing the stories where he left off in the UK. Miracle Man battles his sidekick, Kid Miracle Man, who turned evil and disillusioned with the world. The books were very violent, very gory, very adult. One of them, I think Diamond refused to carry due to the 3-page scene depicting active childbirth from Miracle Man's wife. Again, a different Know Your Lore topic that we'll cover one day. So in 1990, Neil Gaiman takes over writing on Miracle Man. He planned 3 6-issue arcs, the Golden Age, the Silver Age, and the Dark Age. Eclipse went under in 1994, 2 issues into the Silver Age arc. And Miracle Man fell into legal hellholes and obscurity as arguments over the rights began thereafter. In 1996, Todd McFarlane purchases the rights to Miracle Man for about $25,000. In the 2000s, 2001, I think it was, he challenged anyone to prove him wrong that he had the rights to this character when someone specifically asked about Neil Gaiman potentially owning part of the rights. Now, here's where we get to this episode of Know Your Lore, kids. Neil is currently, as this is happening, is in this negotiation with Marvel to potentially do some work with them, right? So he signs a contract with them. He writes a series called 1602, Marvel 1602. I think the actual covers just say 1602 on them. And he takes the money from that miniseries that Marvel paid him. He forms an LLC, a limited liability company, his own company. And what is that company called? Marvels and Miracles. And what does it exist to do? It solely exists to get the rights back to Miracle Man and other characters that he had created when he was writing Spawn. Clearly a huge miscalculation on Todd's part to open his big mouth and really challenge Neil on this aspect. I think Neil's the kind of guy, if Todd had just shut the fuck up and made whatever comics he wanted to make, I don't think Neil would have even ever done any of this. I think he probably would have let it go. I think Todd, again, not being the smartest person, but being a guy who can draw good, opened his mouth and issued a challenge that completely fucked him over in the end. So Gaiman, it turns out, has taken part ownership of Miracle Man when he worked at Eclipse. The publisher owned 2/3, Gaiman owned the other 1/3. In 2009, though, it's revealed that Mick Anglo, who everyone thought had completely sold off the rights or lost them in 1982, actually still had them. So what does Marvel Comics do? Marvel Comics then buys all of the Miracle Man rights in 2009. Neil actually starts to finish his work in 2022, this year, as Marvel reprints some of the Silver Age stories, and they get ready to finish that 18-issue arc that he originally planned across the 3 ages. I'm going to take a break here to pivot and say all of you need to buy these books. This is probably the greatest comics writer alive, and I'm saying that, yes, I know who Alan Moore is, and yes, Neil Gaiman is 10 times the writer that Alan Moore is, and I'll die on that fucking hill. Neil Gaiman's going to finish this story, and you guys, if you want to pick up anything that highlights the art of comic books, pick up anything that Gaiman has done. It elevates the comic book past just a story to the highest form of an art form that it can be. I don't think there's anything bigger and better as a complete story than Sandman in comics, period. A lot of other great stories, a lot of other great creators. I just don't know that there's any whole story start to finish as complete and as good as Sandman. Now, back to Neil Gaiman writing a book for Marvel just to spite Todd McFarlane and finance his lawsuit against him. So that is a lot of backstory to tell you why and how Marvel 1602 was made. That's the series Neil wrote for Marvel to finance this lawsuit. That's where the heart of this story really is. I've actually talked more about everything leading up to it than I'm going to talk about for 1602, but all of those things are just, it's so intricately detailed to how we get to this point, right? It's such a butterfly effect all the way down the chain. It's immensely interesting to me. That's why I make videos like this. Hopefully you enjoy it as well. And so Marvel 1602 was an 8-part series. It's focused in an alternative Elizabethan Marvel universe. It features the X-Men, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Doctor Doom, a host of other Marvel characters reimagined in this world. Prior to this, Neil Gaiman had never worked at Marvel. The announcement of this series was a huge deal. I remember at the time I was working at Mile High Comics, and this was a big deal, guys. The comic world was insane when this was announced that Neil was going to do not just like a story at Marvel, but an entire limited series where he got to do whatever the fuck he wanted. Neil, they gave him carte blanche. Here's a big ass check. Do whatever the fuck you want, Neil. At that point in time, Joe Quesada was the editor at Marvel. This is one of the smartest deals he made. Joe made a lot of other mistakes and poor decisions. We can talk about one more day some other time. I don't want to do a Know Your Lore on that, but we probably should. But anyhow, this is one of the smartest decisions he made. And so at that point in time, Neil had never worked for Marvel. He was a golden boy in the comics world. He hadn't worked for a few years, but like his name, what he did on the Sandman and other books was just so big. It carried so much weight that he could have picked and chosen to go anywhere and write any book. He could have walked into DC and said, hey, I want to write Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. And they would have given him whatever he wanted to do that. He could have walked into Marvel and said, like, yep, I want to write Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, all 4 X-Men main titles. and I want to do that myself. Give me a check. And they would have cut the check. And he would, like, that's how big he was at this time, guys. He was huge. He had won awards for Sandman, usually reserved for novels. They had to change, I think it was the World Fantasy Awards, where they changed the category so that comics couldn't win the award anymore, and just written books could. Again, probably another good episode of Know Your Lore to get into that one. So him coming to Marvel was huge. He could have done anything he wanted, and what he did was this 8-issue miniseries. It may be one of the few projects it almost lived up to the hype. I don't want to say it lived all the way up to it. It was close. It was a good story. It's a really good story. I highly suggest you read it. I am not going to tell you, though, that 1602 is on the level of the Sandman. Anyone expecting that's not what he was doing, and anyone expecting anything to be the Sandman, you're not going to get that. Like, it's just not going to happen again. It was lightning in a bottle. It struck at that moment in time, and I don't know, eventually something will surpass it, but I don't think it'll ever be something Neil does. It's going to be some other artist, some other writer out there that creates something amazing that's just that good as well. It did spawn 3 sequels. It was a good seller. Don't get me wrong. It wasn't like the worst fucking book ever put on the stands. Like, it sold well enough. 1602 The New World, 1602 Fantastic Four, and Spider-Man 1602, all miniseries or single issues that spawned out of this series. The 1602 universe is part of the Marvel multiverse. It's classified as Earth 311 if you really care. So when you're looking at any multiverse books and you see Earth 311, you're in the 1602 universe, boys and girls. Like I said, Joe Quesada was the editor at Marvel in 2001, who approached Neil Gaiman initially to write a Marvel series. Being that it was just after 9/11, Gaiman decided he didn't want to write a story with planes, buildings, bombs, or guns. And that's kind of why the story is set where it is, the way it is. It's something completely different that wouldn't necessarily have any of those things in it. The premise of the tale is that in the year 1602, in this particular universe, 400 years and earlier, all of a sudden, all of these Marvel superheroes start to appear in the universe, and the heroes and villains intermingle with real-world historical figures like Queen Elizabeth I of England and others. I would say it's not quite as underhanded and devious as Game of Thrones, but if you picture a Game of Thrones world with Marvel superheroes like that, you're getting pretty close to what you're going to get there. It's a pretty good mesh of those kind of two ideas. It's a lot of subterfuge and politics, as well as, punches being thrown, right? Overall, it's a good series. I recommend to read. Like I said, did it live up to the hype completely? No. Did it achieve its goal? McFarlane lost the fucking rights to Miracle Man to this day, as well as Angela, who Gaiman also created. For those of you that don't know, Angela in the Marvel Universe came from this same lawsuit being funded by this same book, and eventually ended in settlement when Gaiman took control of Angela, and I believe still owns half of the other 2 characters he created in the Spawn books, and Miracle Man is no longer McFarlane's rights. So did it accomplish its goal? I mean, ultimately, I think there was a lot of handshaking and deals made behind the scenes between Neil and Marvel that eventually got all of this done. I can't prove that, and I should say allegedly that's what happened, so that I'm not implying anything criminal went down. So there you go, kind of a lore double whammy. How DC Comics killing Fawcett Comics Captain Marvel led to Neil Gaiman writing a story just to finance his legal war with Todd McFarlane, the ultimate loser in all of these things. All of that and the Miracle Man in between, you were lucky to get in this episode. Remember to save some for the ladies from everyone else at the bar tonight. When you use this story to impress them, they're going to be throwing pussy at you left and right. Trust me. Remember to hit like and subscribe, guys, and I'll see you on the flip side.